All right, the purpose of Leviticus. As we have seen, this is a book about Yahweh speaking, Yahweh giving instruction, Yahweh communicating aspects of his Torah, of his instruction on how Israel was to conduct their life. And Yahweh gave instruction that enable him to live among his chosen people. Again, remember in chapter 40 of Exodus, Yahweh is already present. That this is not anything that if you offer these offerings, if you live this kind of life, then I will come and live among you. It's very definitely the fact that he is present, and this is what enables him to stay with his people and to have fellowship with them. That they are able to come into his presence. They're able to come before him in an acceptable way. And certainly this fellowship then works itself out into the holy walk that is seen in chapter 17 and following. Now, when we get to the literary structure, and as has been true of the books in the Torah so far, the literary structure, once again, is a major interpretive issue as far as the book is concerned. How are do we understand the structure of this part of the Torah? And the great distinction is between those who see no coherent structure whatsoever. That this is just, and sometimes it's called this is just miscellaneous laws that have been collected and placed at this point within the Torah. Yet I think, as we've said, we need to realize there's a very definite narrative structure that this follows the construction of the tabernacle and Yahweh's entrance, presence by the cloud, by the fire, into the midst of his people. There's a corporate indwelling of Israel by Yahweh. And it's already present. He already indwells. Now, this is so that Israel can take advantage of that indwelling, that they can have fellowship, friendship, peace, harmony between themselves and Yahweh. And then even as they leave the presence of Yahweh, as we said, and live their daily lives, their daily activities, and they can look back and see and live their lives as an echo of their relationship with Yahweh. Once again, this walk, this conduct, was not for their salvation. It didn't bring any more of reality of God within their lives, within their experience. It was a reflection of what God had already done and God's presence already among them. Again, holiness is about sanctification. You will be my sanctified, set-apart people. And you'll experience that in your relationship with me. You will be the kingdom of priests. You will be able to come into my presence, and you will live a holy walk that will give testimony to me in the light of those you come in contact with. Of course, in the wilderness, not kind of coming in contact with nations, but as they were going to go into the land, that they would come in contact with peoples and live their lives as a holy nation, testifying to Yahweh. So there's a real sense in which in Leviticus you're reading the practicalities of Israel being God's special treasure, God's kingdom of priests, God's holy nation. God has only instructed them. God has only come and indwelt them. His presence is in the midst of them. They are a special treasure. They are a unique people among all the peoples of the earth. They're a unique nation among all the nations of the earth. And as we see, even the individual Israelite can select the offerings, kill the offerings, and come to the very doorway, and before the altar, and in that forecourt that he can participate, and then the priests, with the altar, and then certainly with the laver, and then the priest going into the holy place, and ultimately into the Holy of Holies. And again, as we come to the beginning of Numbers, we're going to talk about the tabernacle and how all Israel was centered around that tabernacle. So, this is because of Israel's status. Nothing in Leviticus is given, if you'll obey this, then you'll become my special treasure. If you'll obey this, then you'll become a kingdom of priests. Then you'll become a holiness. It's because that is God's desire, and God already made that means possible. Now, this is how you maintain what has been established. So, this is Leviticus. Enable his people to have fellowship with him. Now, as far as the literary structure, let me, once again speak about the literary frame that we saw in Exodus. Leviticus finds itself right here in the midst of the narrative concerning the covenants that God made with Israel at Sinai. As you can see, that it is part and parcel of the making of that covenant. That God is in the process of entering into this covenant relationship. And through this covenant relationship, Israel, by obeying him, can have fellowship, can enjoy that relationship with him. And as we come to the narrative of Exodus 19 through Numbers chapter 10, there is a break, as we can see in Leviticus chapter 17. And Leviticus 17 really is a hinge chapter. Some would put this with the first 16 chapters. Some would, as I do, put it as really an introduction to what follows, but really is a summing up of what the Lord has been communicating to Israel since Exodus 32, and the golden calf incident, and the fact that Moses is able to intercede on behalf of Israel, have his seeing of Yahweh, and a reminder that Yahweh is a holy God. And yet, because of that forgiveness, the covenant is renewed. In Exodus chapter 24, the tabernacle is allowed to be built and to function as it should. And yet, with all of that, now with a functioning tabernacle, more instruction has to be given to Israel, because they still are being unfaithful to Yahweh and living like the nations. How are they living like the nations? Well, in 17:7, they are still sacrificing sacrifices to the goat demons with which they play the harlot. And what God has to reiterate in chapter 17, verses 1 to 7, is the fact that any animal that is to be sacrificed at the tabernacle and the tabernacle alone. That's what the Lord has commanded. And so any man who slaughters ox, lamb, goat in the camp or outside the camp and has not brought it to the doorway of the tent of meeting to present it as an offering to the Lord before the tabernacle of the Lord, blood guiltiness is to be reckoned to that man. He has shed blood, and that man shall be cut off from among his people. You can't just slay an animal anywhere and sacrifice. You have to bring it to the tabernacle. The reason is so the sons of Israel may bring their sacrifice with their sacrifice in the open field, that they may bring them into the Lord at the doorway of the tent of meeting to the priest, and sacrifice them as sacrifice the peace offerings to the Lord. And why is this a temptation? Because they are, as we've seen in verse 7, sacrificing to the goat demons, to the goat idols. And the goat idols is better. We understand, obviously, from the New Testament that by worshiping and offering these sacrifices to the goats, the goat idols, they were bringing them to the demons that empowered that. But goat idols with which they play the harlot. How important is this? Well, Israel is to bring their sacrifices to the right place. They cannot eat blood, verse 10. For the blood is given to make atonement. Therefore, verse 12, no person among you may eat blood, nor may any alien who sojourns among you eat blood. So when any man from the sons of Israel or from the aliens who sojourn among you and hunting catches a beast or a bird which may be eaten, he shall pour out his blood and cover it with earth. All right, so it does seem as though animals could be eaten as long as they were not sacrificed. But again, the protocol, that does not mean that, like the Gentiles, you can eat, drink the blood. It has to be completely drained. Why? For the life of all flesh, its blood is its life. And blood signifies, bloodshed, the giving up of life. That's why when we took a look at the offerings have to be slaughtered, they have to be killed, and the blood has to be drained. Because the blood represents the life of the flesh. With the blood being taken and splattered, it means that life is ebbed away. That animal dies. And so both Israelite and alien are not to eat the blood of the flesh, or else he will be cut off. And why was this an issue? Well, again, because of the fact that they were practicing idolatry, the goat idols. And so there has to be these stipulations given that then broaden out in chapters 18 to 20 that you are to stay away from the abominable practices associated with the Gentiles and their worship and their life. And in chapter 21 and 22, your priests are to be distinct and different than the priests of the nations. Chapter 23, you have special occasions. Chapter 24, you're to be faithful to the Lord, and one who's unfaithful, even observing the Sabbath, is to be put to death. Chapter 25, you have then, picking up from chapter 23, the seventh year, the sabbatical year, and the year of Jubilee. 26, You have the curses, the blessings, and the curses of the covenant. And chapter 27. You then have well above and beyond what is required if you vow and want to do something in your love for Yahweh, your response to Yahweh. The only thing about a vow is you don't have to vow the vow, but you have to complete the vow. So, and sorry that I left the outline and didn't put it in this new document. But you have the outline. You can pick it up if you got your computers right there. Just pick up the outline, and you will notice that there are two parts. Therefore, based upon this overall structure, at Leviticus 1-16. And I call this the way to God. That this is the means by which God has given Israel that they can come into His presence. And we've already talked about it in the first 7 chapters. They can come by means of the offerings that He has given. That sin does not have to be a barrier between the people and Yahweh. Sin can be dealt with through these offerings. Now, it needs priestly mediation, so therefore in chapters 8-10, we have the priests. But one can only come through even priestly mediation, chapters 11-15, if one is clean. And so Moses has to give a sample. I don't think he necessarily gives every last stipulation that would make an Israelite unclean. But he does deal with some very, very essentials of life. In chapter 11, with the foods you eat. Chapter 12, as we already talked about, with the regulations concerning childbirth. Chapters 13 and 14, the infectious skin diseases. In chapter 15, the issues from the body, bloody issues, seminal issues, etc. And each one of these makes an individual unclean for a certain amount of time and then requires the proper cleansing with the proper offerings, procedures to go through so that one might be clean, so that one might come into fellowship with Yahweh, because he can't come in contact with the holy unless the uncleanness has been dealt with. Then in chapter 16, the culmination that brings us to the most important day of the calendar of Israel under the Mosaic covenant. And this is the great Day of Atonement. And I'm going to leave you to the notes in the MacArthur Study Bible. Dr. MacArthur has a good job of going through the procedures of that day, what the priest did first for himself and then for the nation. But the key is at the end, beginning in verse 29. And this shall be a permanent statute for you. In the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall humble your souls and not do any work. That includes everybody. For it is on this day that atonement shall be made for you to cleanse you, and you shall be clean from all your sins before the Lord. It's a Sabbath, a solemn rest for you, that you may humble yourselves. It is a permanent statute. And so this is the purpose. The purpose of the Day of Atonement was to cleanse, was to wipe away, wash away all the sins of Israel. that Aaron, the two goats, would place his hands and he would confess. Verse 21 of Leviticus 16. All the iniquities of the sons of Israel, all their transgressions, in regard to all their sins. This is what he shall lay on the head of the goat and send it away, the goat that was sent out in the wilderness. As well as the goat that was to make atonement also for the tabernacle and for the vessels used in the tabernacle, and of course offered up before the Lord for all of Israel. But it's not that offered goat that is so much the concentration as this goat that is taken out in the wilderness. And that becomes the picture to Israel. As the goat is led away, with their sins, as it were, passed through the priest from them to this goat, what do they see pictured? I mean, gentlemen, what is it? The goat is bearing away what? Their sins. All their transgressions. Whether witting or unwitting. So the Israelite who sees the priest's activity on his behalf in faith realizes that his sin has been removed. His transgression is gone. He is completely clean before Yahweh, which means what? He can maintain fellowship with Yahweh. The barrier has come down. Now, what happens on the way from the tabernacle on the Day of Atonement? He inadvertently trips over the carcass of a dead animal. We'll make it a cat because I don't like him, so it's dead. All right, hits the carcass. Now, we haven't seen it yet, but we're going to find out that coming into contact with a carcass makes one what? Unclean. So what's he got to do at that point? He's got to do the sin guilt offering to reestablish that fellowship with the Lord. And in that sense, you see, we as New Testament saints, we have a privilege the Old Testament saint didn't have. Because in faith, he could assume, the sacrifice is off. But let's go a little further. He trips over the carcass and realizes this is the cat of brother Jacob, and now is so upset, says, I'm going to give brother Jacob a piece of my mind and my anger, and is going to lash out and speak, out against him, and in fact, to defame him, and call him all kinds of names. You son of a Canaanite woman, etc., etc. Whatever they would do. Now, is this witting or not? Unwitting? No, it's meditated. I'm so mad at him not cleaning up the carcass and making me unclean, I'm going to give him a piece of my... In other words, he's got plenty of time to think this thing through. He's got to find brother Jacob, who's probably also coming back from the Day of Atonement, like himself. And lo and behold, he can't now bring a sin and guilt offering, because this is not an unwitting sin. This is a sin of a high hand. It's a premeditated sin. So now he's got to wait till when? When can he finally say, I can confess, I can repent, I can make restitution for that sin, and know that it's completely forgiven? He has to wait till when? Next year. He's got a whole year under the weight of that sin, and he can't do anything about it until the next year, watching the priest confess the sins, all the transgressions of Israel, all the places that they have transgressed, that they have gone beyond the boundaries of God's instruction, God's Torah, God's commandments, and so that consciousness of sin will remain with him. And lo and behold, what happens? The same thing happens a year from now, and it all happens all over again the same way, because he's a creature of habit. All right, he's still got to wait another year. Well, again, with the burden, the consciousness of sin. You see, he can't look back and have the assurance of God's forgiveness. He can only look ahead, forward, and pray the priest is still alive and the tabernacle is still functioning, and there's enough animals next year to get a couple of goats, for the sins of Israel, or else there is no forgiveness. Now, you can ask the question, what happens if he dies in the meantime? And my answer is, I don't know. I believe if he was a man of faith, individual faith, then he would go to Abraham's bosom from New Testament revelation. If not, he would go to the grave awaiting his eternal doom, his eternal punishment. But there is a sense, and those of you who have, somewhat of a Catholic background that, has viewed themselves as the new Israel with the new priesthood, ministering the new sacrifice of Christ. I mean, how close this is to the fact, okay, if you don't get to the priest at the right time, right place, with the right words, in the right way, then even the past sacrifice of Christ will not be acceptable. Again, you still live in the continual. It always has got to look to the future. I can never look to the past and say, it's been dealt with. That's what we have as New Testament believers that the Old Testament saint didn't have. So, can you praise the Lord that our sacrifice for sin as believers is in the past tense, and we can confess our sin, knowing he's faithful and just to forgive us our sin and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. And we know that because we've already seen the sacrifice given and accepted by God at the cross. That's the distinction, I think, between the Old Testament saint and the New Testament saint. We can look back and see forgiveness. The Old Testament saint could only look ahead and anticipate forgiveness. But until he saw the assurance, he didn't know that for sure. So this great day of atonement, it's the culmination. And Israel needed it because chapter 17, they were still idolaters, and yet God gives them instruction in how, as they leave the tabernacles, I've already brought out, they can be distinct, they can be different than the nations that are around them. With obviously the covenant blessings, which even though will not come to Israel and in the past will come in the future. We'll talk about it when we talk the echo of that in Deuteronomy 28. Further stipulations dealing with the altar and the tabernacle to just tie back to the echoes we've seen previously in the book of Exodus. And so that gives us some idea of the purpose and the structure of Leviticus. Let me just say a word about resources, the bibliography. And the work that I would commend to you is the work by Rooker and the NAC. Notice how NACs are getting stars at this point. Good volumes. So Mark Rooker has written an excellent commentary on Leviticus, and I would commend that as your first read Not least of which is I tend to agree with most of the things that he says in the commentary. There are some other good works you should also be familiar, and I brought it down from exegetical because it really is available to English readers. Technical stuff is usually put in footnotes in the NICOT. But Gordon Wenham's book that came out in the late 70s, there was very little on Leviticus before his work. And so he has had a tremendous impact, and though I wouldn't say it's necessarily the best work on the book anymore, because many have built upon what he has done, you should still be aware of it because of the impact that it has had. It's almost all evangelical commentary on Leviticus, since Wenham all goes back and interacts with him. So it's good to have. And as far as exegetical, Hartley is a good work, and the new work by Kiuchi, who actually did his doctoral work under Wenham in Leviticus, are both good, valuable works, and introduce you to some of the newer exegetical work, both Jewish and Christian, that is on the book, taking it seriously and not literally, and not in an allegorical sense. And probably then have never thought in terms of someday I'm going to preach Leviticus. But gentlemen, you've come to Masses. Someday you will. And you'll find the book by Alan Ross, Holiness to the Lord, a great benefit, just like Genesis, where he starts off with the exegetical discussion, exegetical outline, and then moves it into an expositional, and gives some idea of what he sees as the practical application of Leviticus to New Testament believers. And Matthews and Tyndall are two others that have preached. Matthews is the same, Ken Matthews, that did the commentary on Genesis of the NAC. These are both valuable works, and also Gaines' work, again, that thinks in terms of how do you go from literal interpretation to application to a New Testament believer. So these are just some of the resources that are available on Leviticus, and gentlemen, you are more blessed. 25 years ago, most of these were not available. So a lot of work has been done on Leviticus by evangelical exegetes and expositors in the last 25 years. Who knows? Maybe a generation from now will not say that we get to Leviticus and just skip it. Maybe there'll be more preaching and more teaching out of this portion of the Torah.